Welcome to Baha'i On Air. My name is Graham Hassell and we are at the summer school in Hamilton near Auckland. And we have some special guests with us who've come from Solomon Islands for the summer school. We have Sir Bruce Saunders and Lady Keithie Saunders. Welcome, Bruce and Keithie.
Thank you very much.
How have you found the summer school?
Fantastic. I haven't been to one for a long time. I'm enjoying it very much.
Yes, it's really wonderful. I think actually the last summer school we were at was the one that we actually met at, and that was in Yeranbul in 1965. So that's as long as the last time we've been at a summer school. Living in the Pacific, you don't get to go to these things very often, so it's been a very wonderful experience for us both.
Well, one of the first things that the audience would be interested in knowing is how is it that you came to be members of the Baha'i community in the first place?
I came from a Baha'i family. My parents were of Jewish background and became Baha'is in the United States in the 30s. They were well-established Baha'is, and I grew up as a Baha'i, although as Baha'is you do not automatically become Baha'is. At 15 you decide which religion you would like to be part of, but your parents do educate you in all great religions of the world, so you're able to assess for yourself. And I couldn't find anything better. I did look around and I thought the Baha'i Faith was the answer to today's problems, and I became a Baha'i at 15. Bruce?
Thank you. Yes, a very different story. I have a twin brother who is very inquisitive about what happens when we die, and every time we go past a cemetery the question would come out. So my parents, being of a Methodist background, weren't really able to satisfy that curiosity, and we were 11 at the time, and so that created a curiosity for something, answer for that for my parents. And through an illness and some friends who had, some people came down who'd been cured of the problem my mother had, and it turned out these people were Baha'is, and my parents asked, what is the Baha'i Faith? More so, what is life after death? And they got an answer that really satisfied them, that there was that everyone is entitled to go to heaven based on how they live their life and treat their fellow man, because they were school teachers and were aware that there were other religions, and the view that was coming from the Christian faith at the time to them was that if you're a Christian or you believed in Jesus, you're okay, but if you were of another faith, as they asked what happened to them, well, it wasn't satisfactory, and so that then brought about them accepting.
Well, you have an interesting story because you have such diverse backgrounds in different parts of the world, but you came together at a fairly young age. Now we're talking to you about your life in the Solomon Islands. What happened between the time that you met in New South Wales at a summer school, Baha'i Summer School? You married soon after. You must have had plans of your own, but within a few years you were in Solomon Islands. And I think this is an interesting story for us to learn about. What was your idea when Bruce and Keithie met, and where did you think you were going to settle yourselves and serve the Baha'i community and be employed? What was your idea?
We actually went to the Cook Islands before the Solomon Islands. Well, it was completely emotive, actually. I don't think we had any major plans. Ultimately, we knew we would have to end up in the Solomons because, unfortunately, I'm the only child in the Blum family. There was a tremendous amount of... there was a tremendous legacy there that both of us felt we had obligation to continue. But we wanted to be somewhat independent before that move, and the day after we came back from our honeymoon, we attended a small conference in Sydney, and they were calling for pioneers. So when this call came out, and Bruce had met Rick and Gwen Welland, previously I hadn't met them, and they had gone to the Cooks and written to Bruce and said what a wonderful place it was. They needed pioneers in the Cooks, so we just looked at each other and we said, we'll go. To fulfil that plan, we had to be there by the April 21st, which was part of the plan.
And we achieved it by sailing out of Sydney Harbour and on the 3 p.m. on the 21st of April 1966.
Yes, we were married in the February, And 66 we went to the Cooks. We were told we had to go to New Zealand to get there, and we got some menial jobs to earn some money. We didn't have very much money. We were both fairly flat. Anyway, we finally got our permits to go to the Cooks. And on the way to the Cooks, we had no job, of course. On the way to the Cooks, on the news bulletin was a little ad, notice saying that the manager of the hotel, the only hotel, Aotearoa Rarotonga, had got into some political problems, and he'd been fired, and he was leaving on the boat we were arriving on, because there was no aircraft. So people who we'd met on the boat said, "Why don't you apply for that job with Bruce's qualifications?" I mean, I didn't have much hotel experience, but he did. And so we did apply, and we stayed with Rick and Gwen Welland for a few months. And eventually we got the job, and we became very entrenched with the Cook Island community, Baha'is and otherwise. We revamped the hotel, redecorated it to the point where we ended up doing all the government entertaining for them.
Right. And Keithie, you mentioned in that last section about the Blum legacy, and I think we'd be interested to know what that means. You've written a book recently about your parents. What is significant about the Blums and the Solomon Islands that was so interesting that you felt you could write a book about it to share the story of your parents?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, Alvin and Gertrude independently were of Jewish-Russian background, and their families had escaped the pogroms in Russia, and independently of each other. In fact, Father's family were quite wealthy and didn't leave because of the pogroms. They left about 20 years beforehand in the late 1890s and moved to the United States. And they were furriers, and as I said, and they were quite comfortable. My mother's family, on the other hand, were poorer, and they had rabbis and learned people in their family, and they were targeted by the Russian Cossacks. So they left, and it was the general story, Fiddler on the Roof story, and they arrived in New York through Ellis Island around 1904. And my mother was brought up as an Orthodox Jew, and so was my father. They independently found the faith through a whole variety of searching, independently of each other, and each became Baha'is and met briefly through the faith. They got together quite a few years later and were going to get married just before the war. He was shipped out to the Pacific before they could get married. That wasn't their intention. And Dad ended up in New Zealand as part of the US forces. He was actually ran the dispensary on Princess Wharf. He spent a lot of time in New Zealand and was very charismatic, made a lot of contacts across all faiths, spoke about the Baha'i Faith in many different venues, and went up through the Pacific after most of the main fighting was finished, thank goodness, because he would have probably been killed, and went to the Solomons for 3 or 4 weeks with a hospital ship, and then was discharged. By this time it was nearly 1944, and he was discharged when he went to the Philippines, and that was taken home. After he got home, they married, and I was born, and he asked the guardian of the Baha'i Faith, who was the grandson of the founder of the faith, if he could go back to New Zealand because they loved New Zealand. And he came back to New Zealand, and he and Mother stayed here for 7 or 8 years. Then there was a general call for the expansion of the faith. It was called the 10-Year Crusade. And they volunteered through a whole series of events to go to the Solomons. And they went to the Solomons. We all went. I was 7 or 8 in 1954 to fulfill this plan that had been put through by the Baha'i administration. And I went through those early years in the Solomons. It was very difficult, very challenging. And I saw what they went through. And I realised that my destiny was probably entrenched in those early years. And being the only child, unfortunately, if I had a brother or a sister, it may have been I'd been able to divide the responsibility. But because I didn't, And because Bruce was also a Baha'i, had met my parents, it was very much in admiration of what they'd done and achieved. He was also willing to forego any career path that he had, and was willing to go back. So I was very grateful.
And you had explained to us that you were in the Cook Islands, your parents were in the Solomon Islands. So how was it that you ended up coming soon after being in the Cook Islands? You ended up in Honiara a few years after that.
Well, my father died prematurely. He died in 1968 at the age of 56. He was an adult diabetic, and the conditions in the Solomons in those years were very difficult, very challenging. He'd built extensive number of businesses and created a number of community institutions to develop the community, and it just wore him out in the end, and he wasn't very careful with his diet or any of his medications, and he basically had 2 heart attacks and died on the second. Our first daughter had just been born, Natasha Grace, and she was a month old. We knew we had to go home. We were managing the hotel. We went, the government was wonderful. They put us on an emergency flight that the Americans had in Rarotonga that day. Gave us a New Zealand passport for Natasha because she had just been born. And we were able to get to Pango. If that hadn't been for that flight in, we would have been delayed 2 or 3 weeks because there was no aircraft at that time. And we went back to the Solomons. Bruce subsequently went back and packed up our effects, and we started our life my second life in Solomons in 1968. Bruce
Started mine.
Started his too.
Because I'd never been to the Solomons.
But it seems now that you have spent something like 5 decades working in the Solomons.
That's right.
I wonder if you can tell us about the Baha'i community in the Solomon Islands. If someone's to ask you, what is the nature of the Baha'i community? What do the Baha'is do? Who are the Baha'is in the Solomons? How do you explain the community?
Well, there's a purpose of the Blums going there was to develop the Baha'i community, and it took a couple of years to establish a community, and that came about through their example again, as I mentioned, that they treated people completely equally as the Baha'i Faith teaches. We're all, regardless of colour and religion and race, we're equal, and this wasn't in a British colonial service, was not a feature of the society with the Europeans and the indigenous Solomon Islanders. So, whereas the Blums came and embraced them, brought them into their homes, and through example, were able to make an impact. And through that, the faith gradually spread. And Mr. Blum and Mrs. Blum did much to help people, and went out of their way, which was again unusual. And so they created a lot of interest. So this information went around and people wanted to know, and they learned it was a new religion and what was it, and established, gradually people came to understand it. What they liked was that, here was a religion that didn't make a difference. The Baha'i teaching is for unity and togetherness. They found this very attractive in the fact that they were treated so equally. It was just a natural gradual. And what's happened over the years is they themselves, and more so in recent years, their children have become educated because all of these people would have come either from what was a non-Christian background, a pagan. They became Baha'is, they were attracted to it, and people from Christian faith, because it is essentially a Christian country, and they then have understood, and in fact in learning about the faith, one of the teachings of the faith is independent investigation of truth. They wanted to read, and there's many wonderful writings, and especially prayers, they wanted to read them for themselves. And so this, over 30, 40, 50 years, you've seen a maturity, as we all do, as we grow up. So the Baha'i Faith has established itself. It has brought a sense of purpose. They have an innate common sense, because the people of the Pacific, the Solomon Islanders, still are in touch with their Creator. They still have a spiritual resonance. And they could see this in the Baha'i Faith, this resonant sort of brought them. It was a heart-to-heart process.
And I think the other thing that's very appealing now is that they see the disintegration of some of the services and some of the, where there was a good functioning local spiritual assembly, a Baha'i local spiritual assembly, which is 9 people who manage the affairs of the community in a group of, where there's a group of people, Baha'is, they can take over that role to a degree and organise. They're not the government, but they can help organise services and make sure that the children get educated, and through there's a whole series of educational material through the Baha'i Faith, and they can assist, and they can become the community coordinators, and this is quite valuable. When
they get empowered.
Yes.
What it is, you have people who perhaps traditionally across the world, the Europeans tend to say they're not educated and not have the capacity. But with education and an ability to take into control, which the Baha'i community has at a local level, this, as Keithie mentioned, the 9 members of a local administrative body, then they're in charge of their own affairs. There's not Europeans telling them what to do. They're consulting, and they're very good at consulting. We, as our society, are not so good at consulting and listening to other ideas. They have this ability already. And the process of voting is that all people over 21, male or female, are eligible to serve, and you'll find that most of these local assembly and the National Assembly, which governs the national body that governs the affairs of the Solomon Islands, has men and women on it. And if you look at the National Parliament of the Solomons, for instance, there's only been 1 woman ever, and the second one, so it's very out of 50 people. So these are the things that they value, and aid institutions and people like that want to work with people at local level, and this is where they are learning to see these assemblies can play a role.
Now, the Solomons is made up of many islands and provinces. Are there Baha'is spread throughout the Solomon Islands?
Yes.
Or are they just in the urban centres?
No.
So how do we describe the Baha'i community in Solomons? Where do we find them?
Well, when we came years ago, it was in Honiara, and on one particular island where a chief had become a Baha'i and had been able to obviously lead his people through a process to become Baha'is. The Solomons goes from the tip of Bougainville all the way down to almost to Vanuatu, and you have pockets. The churches are still very strong, and there are times when people embrace a new way of thinking. It's not always welcomed by their families, and especially if they're of strong religious belief. But this also is a positive in a way, because people start to talk about the faith. Why is my son a Baha'i? What has attracted him? Or my one talk, everyone's an extended family. So it is moving throughout the Solomons, and it is, and I think it's the things that Baha'is do. They try and improve their life. They are very focused on getting their children educated. So you have a generation coming through that are more
self-starters. Because people tend to blame the government or want the government to do everything for them. And I think this is another distinctive quality. They, because there's this local spiritual assembly, they decide and they work their own plans out, and they do them as in their capacity.
Well, how does the Baha'i community relate to the authorities? Government wants education, wants people to be healthy, wants to have prosperity in the islands, and this is exactly what the Baha'is are trying to achieve in their communities. So there must be some interaction with government authorities because these are shared goals.
Yes, well, the Baha'is are recognised by the authorities because we're able to incorporate our public properties, our cemetery, and local institutions, and Baha'i marriage is a recognised form of a marriage contract. And sometimes, not always, the churches include us in deliberations, but we're often, the government sometimes ask us to give us their opinion on educational policy. There has been discussions in the Parliament about the Baha'i Faith and its unifying effect by various members, which has been quite interesting. We've had some opposition, but not very much, and it's generally accepted as a unifying, peace-loving. Of course, Baha'is obey the government completely in everything, although we don't get involved with politics at all. And then again, you see the Baha'i administrative system coming through and in a completely non-confrontational way do their elections, and it's all by secret ballot. This is very appealing too, and it becomes very stark as the societies are not functioning very well, the general societies. This new structure that the Baha'is are building becomes more and more appealing.
Now you as a couple and individually have lived very interesting lives. The Solomons is a small country and a small economy, and yet you've had a very interesting career both in business, in public life, with government. I'm wondering, when you meet somebody and they ask, what do you do? How do you describe your career and your service?
We do anything and everything. And really, I mean, because we have our own business, Baha'is don't have any clergy, we don't have any support, so we make our own way, and hence Keithie mentioned before, her parents were in business, and hence why one of the reasons we had to, it was not only just the Baha'i aspect that we wanted to stay in the Solomons, but he had different businesses, and that's where we came in. And as Baha'is, we're service orientated, so we get involved in those sort of things. We get involved in the community, in the business community. So, and as Mr. Blum, when he first went there, he provided services that were needed, and that's, we've looked for niches of services that were needed and in a community, and to establish a foothold. And we've diversified because, as you said, the Solomons is not large, so we have a raft of half a dozen business activities that we do, and one is up and one is down, and we keep a balance to have a good steady income. With the people of the Solomons, you have to earn the respect, and I felt over the years, in the last 10 or so years, because we've been there 40 odd years, I felt myself that I was part of them, and I think they saw us, because we were through into independence. A lot of people moved, we stayed on. We continued to develop a building. We showed our confidence in the community, and we were always willing to share ideas. I mean, after Keithie's mother died, the family started the Blum's Award, which was in their name, recognising people for service, either an individual woman and a male person, of their service to the community, and also a group and a village. The name Blum was already prominent because of what her parents had done. So we were building on a very solid foundation and continuing in that process. And I think, and we integrated, and the Baha'is for many years promoted United Nations Days and things like this. So we were in the forefront of trying to raise the aspirations
of the Solomons. Yeah, we worked to try and promote the Solomons. I was the Commissioner General for the Expo 88 for the Solomons. I was spending more time in Brisbane at the time because our daughters were being educated, and they asked me if I would take this role, which was representing the government of the Solomons. We learned our lessons from Alvin and Gertrude, and we tried to continue that. And Bruce is always helping people, giving them advice or looking out for them. And I am very involved with an environmental group. I got very distressed when I saw the masses of trees being cut down on the main street when they were widening the road. And I started a beautification committee, which our goal was to enhance the city with urban plantings in an environmentally beautiful way. And that was 18 years ago, and it's grown and grown and grown, and the work that we've done is very, very obvious now. So that's sort of what I put a lot of my energies into, plus of course my job. I'm the consular agent for the United States of America. I represent the United States government, and we take care of all American related activities. So that gives me an interest in the developmental side, on the donor side. And then Bruce, with his very many business activities, very, very involved with the Chamber. And his project that he did a few years back, honouring the Solomon Scouts and the Coast Watchers who provided so much support for the Allies during World War II, has been quite outstanding.
The Solomon Islands, there's 90 languages, there's 10 major islands, There's each language group is like an own ethnic group. They became independent in a very short space of time, so there was no feeling we are one nation. And although when they travelled out overseas, they said they were Solomon Islanders, internally they would be this particular language group or this sort of people. And the Americans have been coming back honouring their servicemen, and they have a memorial. The Japanese have their own memorial and come back. And the thing that caught my attention was that when they talked about these men who served with the Americans, the scouts, who provided, a major contribution to the success, because they could gather intelligence and work with the coast watchers, who the Australians had put in place to be the eyes and ears of what the enemy were doing. They always referred to these men as Solomon Scouts. They weren't from a Western province. They weren't said this is a Malaita Scout and so forth. And they hadn't been honoured. So the idea was to create. In 2009 we started that process. By 2011 we built the first phase. It was a 3-stage phase. It is now complete. It is called the Pride of Our Nation, and it is honouring what these people and their forebearers have done to create and preserve the Solomons as it was, and their service to their loyalty, their bravery, their steadfastness to the Allies. And the names of all these people who were the scouts who served their people so well, with the Australian and British Coast Watchers, are all on a plinth that's part of this whole thing. And now, when dignitaries come, they honour by having wreath laying at the National Monument. This is uplifting, it's acknowledging who they are, and the young generation, because the Solomon Islands is, 600,000 people, half of which are 25 and under. So they didn't have the history of it all.
There was quite a feeling that they'd been forgotten after World War II, and they had been very, very loyal and very supportive of the Allied forces. And there was a fair amount of bitterness that they had been forgotten. In fact, Alvin started the first Veterans Association with Sergeant Major Vuza, one of the war heroes of the Solomons, and brought them together as a group, a veterans group. But unfortunately, after the war, the Americans handed the islands back to the British government, as was the agreement, and it kind of came like a little bit of a backwater for development. And the Americans left and didn't do any major development there. So a lot of them did express their bitterness that we had, in some cases, given their lives to assist the Allies, and they had not given anything back. And this is what both Bruce and I, over the years, felt was very strongly, that they should have some form of acknowledgement.
And probably that is what has been our purpose of our life. We've done that in the community, either in business, either in community service, in visiting the villages and spreading the people, the message of Bahá'u'lláh, who we believe is the prophet, the latest teacher of God for this day and age, to bring unity. And when you teach the concept of unity, that's a natural, sometimes for a non-Indigenous person, that is not readily acceptable. Yet you share these things. These are natural feelings that they have. Unfortunately, as politics comes in, there's the worst side of our Western civilization comes to the fore. Corruption, which is a worldwide problem, comes in and creates difficulties. But they're on a path, on a journey, as the world is, towards unity, to coming together, to understanding there is a creator who has a purpose. I mean, the exciting thing I feel for the Solomons is there are Solomon Islanders who have gone out and have what I call, they were island-centric, their own environment. Now they're regional, had understanding, going to various universities and that around. Now they're world-centric because of the mass communication, the telephone, and probably the biggest thing that is going to enhance unity and development has been the mobile phone, and that's a worldwide phenomenon. And it's really, we can see that in the last 3 to 5 years. So there's a spirit of the age, which we as Baha'is believe is unity of mankind, peace of mankind. And that, to achieve that, you can't have isolation and people not coming together, because it's the opposite. So this is what the purpose of our continuing on to be of service there and doing these sort of things.
Bruce, Keithie has mentioned some elements of her work in the community, but am I right that both her mother Gertrude Blum and Keithie have been recognised by government?
Yes.
I wonder if you could tell us about
Okay.
those achievements.
Well, Keithie's mother, for many, she was mother to everyone, and she did a lot of work in the Red Cross, and just her home was, if anyone came, they ended up with a cup of tea and a piece of banana cake. So she was honoured in the 80s with the award, the MBE, the Member of the British Empire. And in that, it was interesting that it was stated she was awarded for her service to the community and service to the Baha'i Faith. And that's, I think it shows they recognise the Baha'i Faith. Then Keithie, with all her work with the, as you mentioned, the garden beautification, when there's been big conferences, Keithie would be asked to help organise the event. Like, for instance, 50 heads of state from the Commonwealth countries had a conference for youth ministers. Well, she was a very integral part of that, as were very other senior people. So it was that sort of thing, and again, I think recognising what her parents, because the name Blum has not died in the Solomons. So, and she was awarded in 2008 the Order of the British Empire, OBE.
So it seems that although she received an award before you, but...
no, actually, I have to interject there, because
right.
Bruce actually did receive the OBE in 2003.
Now, I'd forgotten that. Right.
Yes, he had received it, and we went to Buckingham Palace, and Prince Charles gave it to Bruce. Bruce, one thing he didn't say during the coup years, when the Solomons were torn apart by ethnic unrest, Bruce and 2 or 3 other like-minded people started civil society to try and work a way through this. It wasn't the only part, but they played an integral part of trying to represent the community, what the community in general, without bringing attention to themselves, they just tried to bring the community in general, to give them a voice, to talk about a solution. And that was pointed out, that we didn't realise quite how much notice this was being taken of by Canberra and New Zealand, the people who were putting together a support group which ended up becoming Ramsay Regional Assistance Mission to Solomon Islands. How much notice they'd taken of this group, and Bruce was an integral part of that. And for that and all his work previously, he was awarded the OBE.
And more recently, Bruce has been given the honour of a knighthood
Yes.
from Buckingham Palace.
Yeah. Ultimately, I think the culmination, which was probably the reason that he was nominated, was the monument, which we described earlier. We were fortunate to go to London, and Queen Elizabeth knighted Bruce, and we took our 3 daughters to see the event. It was very special. Bruce, I have to say that he's the only Australian that has ever received that honour, and I think it's the Governor-General of Australia had to be asked if she approved before he could accept it.
Now, you've mentioned that you've recently completed this book about your parents. Yeah. I was wondering whether you feel there are projects in the Solomons that your parents wanted to complete. Did they achieve what they set out to do? How do you see the achievement of the Blums in the Solomons for the Baha'i community and for the people of the Solomons?
Did they achieve what they wanted to? I think they did in the Baha'i sense. In 1972, the National Assembly of the Baha'is were formed. Before that, they'd been part of the South Pacific. The Baha'i Faith was incorporated. They had their own cemetery. We could have our marriage laws. Corporation, they're considered a bona fide religion. That all was achieved during my mother's lifetime.
And the community of the believers, who are many thousands.
There's many thousands of Baha'is
and
now, many local assemblies, Baha'is almost on every island in the Solomons. And wherever you go, people said to me, we went to a little village somewhere there and we said, and they were Baha'is. They said, "Did you hear of the Baha'is? This little village." "Oh yes, we know the Baha'i Faith, Allahu Akbar," they'd say. And you're going down the street, people say Allahu Akbar, you no idea who they are. They're probably not Baha'is, but they'd heard. It's a Baha'i greeting, and they greet you that way. So that's lovely. That really is. And I think they both followed the instructions of the guardian of the faith when they first went there. He said, "Die where you choose to serve," and they did.
Well, thank you very much to Sir Bruce and Lady Keithie for speaking this afternoon with Baha'i On Air.
It's our pleasure. Thank you, Graham.
So you've been watching Baha'i On Air, coming to you from the summer school in Hamilton, and we look forward to seeing you again. Bye-bye for now.